I exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave my shoulders. I reached for my water glass, planning to take a quiet sip, when a sudden jolt shook the back of my chair. Water spilled down my wrist, and I turned around, ready to accept an apology from a careless waiter. Instead, I found myself staring into the weathered and desperate face of an elderly African-American man. He wore a faded wool coat that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. His eyes, though framed by deep wrinkles, were intensely sharp and wide with terrifying urgency. Before I could speak, before I could even ask if he was okay, his rough, trembling hand reached out. He grabbed my left hand, his fingers pressing painfully against my wedding ring. With one quick, practiced motion, he shoved a tightly crumpled ball of paper into my palm. "Run," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with pure terror. "Run while you still can. Don't drink anything. Don't go home with him." He released my hand instantly and turned away, shuffling quickly toward the kitchen service doors before I could process the strange encounter. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat frozen, my fingers clenched tightly around the small bundle of paper. I glanced around the restaurant, but nobody had noticed. The wealthy diners at the surrounding tables were completely absorbed in their Wagyu steaks and vintage wines. Slowly and carefully, I unrolled the crumpled bundle beneath the table. It was a thick white cloth napkin. Inside was a crisp folded $100 bill. Written across the center of the napkin in black ink and rushed uneven handwriting were 3 terrifying sentences. "She poisoned her. Locker 402, combination 814. My soul dropped into my stomach. She poisoned her. My mind instantly raced back to the first night Julian and I met. He had been so vulnerable, so open about his past. He told me about Maya, his first fiancée. He had cried while holding my hands, telling me how she died from a sudden tragic heart attack just weeks before their wedding 3 years ago. He said it destroyed him. I leaned slightly forward, pretending to admire the glass. The chandelier light hit the liquid. At the bottom of the glass, settled beneath the pale golden liquid, was a faint cloudy white residue. It was a powder that had not fully dissolved. My blood turned to ice. She poisoned her. Julian hadn't stepped away to answer a phone call. He had gone to find a private moment to crush something into my drink. He had timed it perfectly, knowing the waiter was busy and I would be distracted by his charming exit. He was sitting across from me right now, smiling with his beautiful, devastating smile, waiting for me to consume a lethal dose of whatever was sitting at the bottom of that glass. "Come on, Simone," Julian coaxed, his tone shifting from romantic to slightly impatient. His eyes narrowed by a fraction of an inch. "Drink. It's bad luck to leave a toast waiting." I looked into the eyes of the man I loved, the man I had trusted with my life and my considerable financial portfolio, and I realized with absolute clarity that I was looking at a predator. I was not a wife to him. I was an asset, and my liquidation date had just arrived. I needed to get out of this restaurant, and I needed to do it right now. But I knew that if I panicked, if I screamed or caused a scene, he would find a way to control the narrative. He would play the concerned husband. He would take me to a hospital of his choosing. I had to be smarter than him, and I only had seconds to make my move. I took a deep breath, forcing my hand to tremble just enough to look natural. I reached for the champagne glass, but instead of wrapping my fingers around the crystal stem, I let my hand slip. My knuckles struck the heavy base of the glass. It tipped over instantly. The pale golden liquid, mixed with the poison he had intended for me, cascaded across the white tablecloth and splashed directly into my lap onto my cream-colored silk dress. A few line cooks glanced at me, a woman in a ruined designer dress marching through their workspace, but nobody stopped me. I moved with absolutely terrifying purpose. I spotted the heavy red exit sign glowing above a metal door at the far end of the kitchen. I shoved it open and stepped into the cool, damp night air. I was standing in a narrow alley behind the restaurant. The smell of dumpsters and wet asphalt hit me immediately. My chest heaved as I frantically looked left and right. At the end of the alley, a young man was sitting on the hood of a beat-up Honda Civic, smoking a cigarette beside a pile of food delivery bags. I ran toward him. He jumped off the hood, his eyes widening at the sight of me. "Hey, ma'am, you can't be back here," he started to say. I reached into the pocket of my ruined silk dress and pulled out the crumpled $100 bill Silas had given me. I pressed it directly against the driver's chest. "Take this," I said, my voice completely stripped of panic. "I need you to get in your car right now and drive me as far away from this alley as possible." Without asking questions, the kid looked at the crisp $100 bill, then back at me. He tossed his cigarette onto the ground, crushed it beneath his sneaker, and unlocked the doors. "Get in." I dove into the passenger seat. Before I had even fastened my seatbelt, the Honda shot out of the alley and merged recklessly into Atlanta traffic. I shrank low in the seat, keeping my head beneath the window line. The neon city lights blurred past the windshield. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I had actually done it. I was out. Then my purse vibrated. I opened my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with Julian's name and a smiling wedding photo of us together. The sight of his face turned my stomach. I ignored the call. 5 seconds later, a text message appeared. "Where are you?" I checked the bathroom. "The hostess said she didn't see you leave." I didn't respond. Another text arrived immediately. "Simone, you're scaring me. Please answer the phone." My thumb hovered over the power button. My silk dress was sticky and cold, and I was trembling, but my mind was completely clear. I walked into the store, past the rows of junk food and cheap sunglasses, and headed straight for the cashier. "I need a prepaid burner phone," I said, pulling my emergency credit card from my wallet and a charger. The cashier, a bored-looking woman snapping her gum, tossed a cheap plastic phone package onto the counter. I swiped my card, opened the package, and powered on the device while standing right there in the aisle. I was an auditor. I spent my days following money trails, uncovering lies hidden inside accounting ledgers. Julian thought I was some fragile, naive woman he could manipulate and discard. He thought he could drain my life and my bank accounts without leaving a trace. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had married a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a fraud. I left the gas station and headed toward the flickering neon sign of the motel next door. I had a burner phone, the clothes on my back, and the locker combination the old man had given me. It was time to find out exactly who I had married and how much he had already stolen from me. The heavy wooden door of room 12 slammed shut behind me, and I immediately locked the deadbolt. I slid the metal chain into place and dragged a heavy scratched wooden chair from the corner, wedging it tightly beneath the doorknob. The motel room smelled like cheap bleach and stale cigarette smoke. The floral bedspread was faded, and the single lamp on the nightstand cast a harsh yellow light across the peeling wallpaper. It was worlds away from the crystal chandeliers and imported champagne of the restaurant, but at that moment, it was the safest place in the world. I peeled off my ruined silk dress, shivering as the damp fabric clung to my skin, and tossed it onto the floor. I slipped on the thin complimentary white bathrobe hanging in the bathroom and sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. My hands finally started trembling as the pure adrenaline of the escape began to fade. But I could not afford to fall apart. Not yet. I tore open the prepaid burner phone packaging. I powered it on, connected to the motel's unsecured Wi-Fi, and immediately downloaded a virtual private network app to mask my location. 2 hours ago, he kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and walked away from the table to take a business call to calm his brother Kendrick about a zoning permit. He wasn't talking to his brother about zoning permits. He was authorizing a wire transfer from my personal account. The initial shock quickly transformed into a hot, blinding wave of pure rage. The tears I thought I might cry evaporated completely. I was no longer a terrified bride running from a killer. I was an auditor staring at an active crime scene, and the thief had just left fingerprints everywhere. I clicked the expanded details of the pending wire transfer. Most people looked at a bank statement and only saw names and amounts. I looked at routing transit numbers, SWIFT codes, and intermediary clearinghouses. The money was not being sent to a local domestic bank. It was being routed through a regional financial hub in Delaware destined for an entity registered as Apex Holdings LLC. I recognized the corporate structure instantly. Apex Holdings was not a real company. It was a shell corporation, a front entity designed to receive funds and immediately bounce them into an offshore tax haven, laundering the money completely away from its source. It was a classic textbook asset extraction scheme. But Julian had made one critical mistake. He was not a forensic accountant. I opened a new tab and accessed the public corporate registration database I use daily for corporate audits. I typed in Apex Holdings LLC and pulled up its articles of incorporation. The registered agent for the LLC was a boutique law firm located right there in Atlanta. It was the exact same law firm his brother Kendrick used to manage his supposedly massive real estate empire. The entire picture snapped together with terrifying clarity. The $50,000 transfer sat just below the exact threshold that would have triggered a mandatory fraud department verification call from my bank. Julian knew my banking limits. He had transferred the maximum amount he could quietly siphon away. This was a bridge loan to keep his brother's fraudulent real estate development afloat. It flashed 2 a.m. I couldn't stay hidden. If I disappeared, if I ran away and started a new life under another name, Julian would win. He would file a missing person report, wait out the legal requirement, and eventually claim my estate. He would still get away with murder and use my hard-earned money to do it. I refused to let that happen. I had built my empire with my own hands, and I was not about to let a charming parasite and his arrogant family steal it from me. I was going to that bus station. I was going to open that locker and read whatever files Silas had left for me. Then I was going to systematically dismantle Julian's entire life. I powered off the burner phone and lay back against the flat motel pillows. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I spent the rest of the night calculating my next move. Tomorrow morning, I would no longer be the terrified woman running through an alley. I would be the wife returning home, ready to play the game until I had everything I needed to destroy them all. The morning sunlight felt harsh and unforgiving as I stepped out of the grim motel room. I had barely slept, my mind cycling through every possible financial permutation and legal loophole. I walked to a cheap thrift store a few blocks away and bought a pair of dark jeans and an oversized black hoodie to cover my stained silk dress. I paid in cash using the change from the $100 bill Silas had given me. I couldn't risk using a credit card or requesting a rideshare. Julian would be monitoring my digital footprint like a hawk. Instead, I took 3 different city buses back toward my neighborhood, meticulously checking over my shoulder at every stop. I needed to get back into my townhouse. I had purchased the property 3 years earlier entirely in my own name, long before I met Julian. It was my sanctuary. Inside my home office sat my secure work laptop, fortified with military-grade encryption and direct access to my firm's master servers. Without it, I couldn't track the rest of the offshore accounts or secure my clients' assets. I also needed my passport and the emergency cash I kept hidden inside a hollow encyclopedia on my bookshelf. The plan was simple: get in, pack a discreet duffel bag, and leave in under 5 minutes. But as I walked up the pristine sidewalk toward my front porch, every muscle in my body suddenly tightened. Parked directly across the street, half hidden beneath the shadow of a large oak tree, was a sleek matte black Range Rover. It was Kendrick's car. My heart slammed against my ribs. I quickly scanned the street, but it was quiet. I climbed the porch steps and reached into my hoodie pocket for my keys. That was when I noticed the small glowing indicator light on my digital deadbolt. It was supposed to glow solid red when armed. Instead, it was glowing a soft, welcoming green. The entire security system had been disabled. I could feel his strong hands gripping my shoulders, his fingers digging into my muscles, keeping me locked in place. He wasn't hugging me out of relief. He was physically restraining me, testing whether I would resist. He buried his face against my neck, breathing heavily, playing the role of the terrified, devoted husband to absolute perfection. I didn't hug him back. I stood completely rigid, my arms hanging at my sides, my eyes fixed over his shoulder at the rest of the family. Evelyn stood up, smoothing the perfectly tailored tweed skirt she wore. Her face was fixed in a mask of cold disapproval. "Where the hell have you been, Simone?" she demanded, her tone dripping with disdain. "Julian stayed up all night calling hospitals and police stations. Do you have any idea the stress you've caused my son? And during your honeymoon, no less." Chloe uncrossed her legs and tossed the magazine aside. She placed her ceramic mug directly onto my glass coffee table, completely ignoring the coasters sitting inches away. "We were literally about to call the psychiatric ward," Chloe added, her voice soaked in fake concern and condescending sympathy. "You can't just disappear into the night like a lunatic, Simone. People talk." Slowly but firmly, I pushed Julian backward, breaking his grip on my shoulders. I stepped fully into the living room, my eyes scanning the space. Right beside Chloe's mug, carelessly sitting on the coffee table, was a shiny, freshly cut silver key. "How did you get in here?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and emotionless. Julian released a shaky sigh and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. "I made a copy of the key last week, my love, for emergencies. And thank God I did. When you ran out of the restaurant last night screaming at the waiters and throwing your glass on the floor, I thought you were having a complete mental breakdown. I was terrified you came home and hurt yourself. I had to override the alarm box in the garage just to get inside." I stared at him, screaming at waiters, throwing my glass. I had silently spilled my drink and slipped out the back door without making a sound. He was already rewriting history. He was laying the foundation for his backup plan. If the poison didn't work, he was going to build a narrative that I was suffering from severe psychological instability. Kendrick finally looked up from his phone and stood, towering over me with his broad, intimidating frame. "This is exactly what happens when a woman becomes too obsessed with her own ambition," Evelyn continued, her tone turning icy and final. "She weaponized my career with surgical precision. We all warned Julian. We told him your little accounting firm was putting far too much pressure on your fragile mind. You are so desperate to prove you don't need anyone that you've fractured your own reality completely. Independence is fine, Simone, but you've turned it into psychosis. You think everyone is against you because you don't know how to exist inside a loving, established family." Chloe shifted comfortably on the velvet sofa, lifting my favorite hand-painted ceramic mug to her lips. She took a long, loud sip of my expensive dark roast coffee. Crossing her legs, she looked like the perfect image of wealthy privilege, completely comfortable sitting inside a home she could never afford herself while judging the black woman who owned it. "Honestly, Simone," Chloe sighed, her voice dripping with fake pity, "Julian told us about your little episodes before the wedding. We thought you were getting therapy. We really did. But this behavior. She gestured dismissively toward my thrift store clothes and tangled hair. This is completely unhinged. I stared at her, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second. Julian had been laying the groundwork for my insanity long before we walked down the aisle. He had been planting seeds of doubt, telling his family I was unstable so that when the time came to eliminate me, nobody would ask questions. It's already difficult enough for this family to integrate someone from your background, Chloe added, leaning forward with a sickly sweet smile. We've tried so hard to be welcoming. We really have. But your working-class roots are screaming today. She sat back down on the love seat, smoothing her tweed skirt as her tone shifted from aggressive to professional. He has already drafted an email to the senior partners at your firm explaining that you are dealing with a severe family emergency and require absolute privacy. All you need to do is sign a temporary power of attorney until you're back on your feet. There it was. The real move. The transition from medical concern to complete financial control. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. If the poison failed to kill me, their backup plan was to strip away my legal autonomy through forced psychiatric intervention. They were going to empty my accounts legally using my own coerced signature while pretending to be the loving, supportive family. It's for your own good, sweetheart, Chloe chimed in with that same saccharine smile. You're just not equipped to handle this level of pressure. You grew up fighting for scraps and now you suddenly have everything. It's classic imposter syndrome turning into severe paranoia. Let the men handle the heavy lifting for a while. You can go to a nice quiet retreat. Julian found a wonderful private facility in upstate New York. No cell phones, no laptops, no outside contact, just uninterrupted healing. A private facility. No phones. No laptops. The blood roared in my ears, but outwardly I remained the portrait of a broken woman. If I got into a car with them, nobody would ever see me again. They would lock me inside a private psychiatric ward owned by one of Julian's associates, sedate me into oblivion, and drain my accounts while I lay in a chemically induced haze. I looked around my beautifully decorated living room at the people sitting on my expensive furniture, drinking my premium coffee, calmly planning my complete erasure from the world. I inhaled slowly. Then I dropped the mask entirely. I had just detonated a bomb in the middle of their carefully staged intervention. They had expected me to scream about contaminated champagne. They expected me to sound crazy. They did not expect me to reference a hidden, highly specific financial transaction that only a forensic accountant would know how to trace. Kendrick recovered first. He threw his phone onto the reading chair and crossed the room with heavy, aggressive steps. He stopped inches from me, using his massive build to physically intimidate me. He looked down at me, his eyes dark and furious. "Watch your mouth, Simone," Kendrick growled, his voice low and threatening. "That was a bridge loan. We discussed it last month. You agreed to advance capital for zoning permits. If your memory is so fractured that you can't even recall authorizing a simple bank transfer for your own husband's business, then you're in worse shape than we thought." I laughed. It was a sharp, humorless sound that echoed through the tall ceilings. A bridge loan. That's fascinating, Kendrick, because my bank records show the transfer was initiated from an IP address that came directly from Julian's mobile phone while I was sitting alone at the table. And as for Apex Holdings, I know it's a shell corporation managed by your law firm, BTI. You're not buying zoning permits, you're hiding assets. Evelyn stood abruptly, her composure finally breaking, her face flushing with ugly, angry rage. "Enough," she snapped, her voice sharp and authoritative. "We are not going to sit here and listen to these delusional paranoias. Julian is clearly completely disconnected from reality. She is a danger to herself and to this family's reputation. Call them now." "Call who?" I demanded, my eyes moving between Evelyn and Julian. Julian pulled his phone from his pocket, his face hardening into a cold, unrecognizable mask. The charming, loving husband had disappeared completely. He tapped the screen once. "I told you, Simone," he said quietly. "We're getting you help, whether you want it or not." I looked toward the front window. Through the sheer curtains, I saw the doors of Kendrick's black Range Rover open. Two men stepped out. They weren't wearing medical coats. They were wearing dark suits, their builds broad and muscular. They looked less like healthcare professionals and more like private security contractors. They began walking decisively toward the steps of my entrance. My heart slammed against my ribs. They were going to drag me out of my own house. They were going to force me into that van, take me to whatever unregulated facility they had arranged, and lock me away. Once inside, declared legally incapacitated by a doctor on their payroll, Chloe's threat would become reality. Julian would gain full power of attorney, drain my firm, liquidate my properties, and erase my entire life without firing a single shot. I stepped away from Kendrick, my mind racing at full speed. The front door was blocked. Julian and Evely stood between me and the kitchen exit. The two men were already turning the doorknob. Face twisted into real panic. "Turn it off," Julian shouted, barely audible over the alarm. "Turn it off now, Simone." I stepped out from behind the curtain. My face was completely calm despite the chaos erupting around me. "This specific alarm button doesn't require company verification," I shouted, enunciating every word clearly. "The police are already on their way. They'll be here in under 2 minutes." Evely grabbed her designer handbag from the sofa, eyes wide with terror. If the police arrived and found hired muscle dragging a screaming woman out of her own home, there would be no way to bury it. It would become a public scandal, a criminal investigation, and the destruction of the pristine social reputation she valued above everything else. "We have to go," Evely screamed, grabbing Julian's arm. "No!" Kendrick didn't hesitate. He shoved the two men back toward the hallway and ran out the front door, sprinting toward his black Range Rover. Chloe practically stumbled out of the sofa, ignoring the spilled coffee and broken glass, her heels clicking in a frantic rhythm as she followed her husband. Julian stayed frozen for a fraction of a second, staring at me. The look in his eyes was pure, unfiltered hatred. The mask was gone completely. He knew I had beaten him. He knew I had broken his trap. "You'll regret this," he mouthed. Then he turned and ran. I stood alone in the center of my living room, the alarm still screaming around me, watching through the window as they piled into the SUV and sped away, tires screeching against the asphalt. I waited exactly 60 seconds to be sure they were gone. Then I walked to the main security panel in the hallway, entered my override code, and silenced the alarm. The sudden silence was heavy and disorienting. I quickly called the security company, gave them my verbal cancellation code, and confirmed it was a false alarm. I didn't want police there yet. Not yet. I didn't have enough hard evidence to put Julian away permanently, and I knew an early investigation would only give his family time to destroy the paper trail. I had exactly 20 minutes before Julian realized the police weren't coming and tried to return. I ran upstairs to my home office, bypassed my secure work laptop password with a biometric scan, and immediately backed up my entire hard drive onto an encrypted flash drive. I pulled my oversized hoodie closer to my face and navigated the crowded concourse, following the overhead signs pointing toward baggage storage. Not far in, I found the wall of dented gray metal lockers tucked into a dim corridor near the bathrooms. I walked down the row, my eyes scanning the faded black numbers painted on the doors. For 100, for 101. For 02, I stopped. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled white napkin from the restaurant. Combination 814. I extended my hand and turned the small metal dials on the built-in combination lock. 814. I grabbed the cold metal handle and pulled. The locker door opened with a hollow metallic click. Sitting alone in the dark, empty space was a thick, heavy manila envelope secured with a red cord tie. I reached in and pulled it out. The weight in my hands felt immense. It was the physical weight of a ghost. I expected you to be here an hour ago. I spun around sharply, my heart jumping into my throat. Standing 10 feet behind me, half hidden in the shadows of the corridor, was Silas. He wore the same faded wool coat he had at the restaurant, but under the harsh fluorescent light of the terminal, he looked even older. His eyes were deeply sunken, carrying a profound, silent exhaustion that only comes from unimaginable grief. I had a small pest control issue at my house this morning, I replied, my voice steady, but I handled it. Silas nodded slowly and gravely. He stepped forward, his eyes dropping to the thick envelope in my hands. I was a private investigator in Chicago for 30 years, he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. Spent my whole career tracking cheating spouses, missing assets, corporate fraud, but I couldn't see the predator sitting in my own living room until it was too late. I looked at the envelope. Maya, I said softly. My daughter, Silas replied. His voice cracked on the words, a raw, shattered sound that echoed off the tiled walls. She was 28. Brilliant. Beautiful. Had just been made partner at a top marketing firm. She met Julian at a charity gala I practically forced her to attend. He swept her off her feet. Charming, wealthy, respectful, the perfect man. 6 months later, they were engaged. 7 months later, she was dead. A chill ran across my skin. Silas motioned toward the main terminal. There's a cafe across the street, he said. It's loud and nobody pays attention to anyone. We can talk there. I followed him out of the bus terminal into a narrow, greasy cafe that smelled of burnt coffee and fried bacon. We slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the far corner. A tired waitress dropped off 2 black coffees and walked away without a word. I placed the manila envelope on the sticky Formica table. I looked back down at the file. Beneath the medical examiner's report was a stack of financial records. This was Silas's life's work as a private investigator, and it was exactly the language I spoke fluently. I began flipping through the bank statements, credit card bills, and wire transfer receipts. The pattern was so brutally identical to my own situation that it turned my stomach. Julian had isolated Maya's finances almost immediately after the engagement. There were massive withdrawals from her investment accounts, cleverly disguised as joint investments in Kendrick's fake real estate development company. Julian had systematically drained her liquid assets, moving the money through a labyrinth of shell companies parked in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. He bled her dry, I said, my eyes scanning the routing numbers. He took exactly $400,000 in the span of 3 months. That was just the appetizer, Silas said bitterly. Keep reading. I pulled the final document from the bottom of the stack. It was a 40-page legal contract printed on heavy premium paper. I looked at the header and felt my breath catch completely. It was a life insurance policy. Julian hadn't just stolen Maya's savings, he had engineered the final payout. I turned to the declaration page. The coverage amount was staggering. The policy was a specialized accelerated term life insurance agreement, the kind that requires aggressive premium payments, but bypasses the long medical underwriting process. My eyes dropped to the signature line at the bottom of the page. Maya's neat, elegant handwriting was there in blue ink, right beside Julian's bold signature. And just beneath it was the execution date. I did the math in my head, comparing the contract date to the autopsy report date. She signed this exactly 3 weeks before she died, I whispered. Silas nodded, a single tear escaping his eye and tracing down his weathered cheek. He was the sole beneficiary. Since they weren't legally married yet, The insurance company tried to fight the payout, but Julian's expensive Kendrick lawyers threatened them with a massive bad faith lawsuit. They settled. Julian walked away with $5 million tax-free. 2 weeks later, he packed up, left Chicago, and disappeared completely. It took me 2 years to track him to Atlanta. By the time I found him, he was already putting a wedding ring on your finger. I leaned back into the vinyl booth, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the sociopathy. Julian wasn't just a con artist. He was a highly organized, completely ruthless Black widow. He targeted successful, independent Black women. He used his charm to bypass defenses, isolated finances, and then killed for insurance payouts and to fund his family's lavish lifestyle. Evelyn, Kendrick, and Chloe weren't just enabling him. They were the board of directors of a murder-for-profit syndicate. They lived in mansions and drove luxury SUVs funded by the blood money of Julian's dead wives. He needed you gone before you audited your own marriage. I looked again at the autopsy report. Clean toxicology, sudden heart attack. Julian had access to a fast-metabolizing agent, something completely undetectable in standard medical exams. That was the cloudy white residue at the bottom of my champagne glass. I carefully stacked the documents and slid them back into the manila envelope, tying the red cord tightly. The fear that had gripped my chest since last night was gone now, replaced by something colder, calculated fury. Julian thought he could outsmart me. He thought I was just another mark. "What are you going to do?" Silas asked. I slid the envelope into my duffel bag and zipped it shut. "I'm going to do what I do best," I said. "I'm going to audit him." I left Silas in the cafe and took a taxi straight to the financial district. My firm occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek glass skyscraper in the heart of downtown Atlanta. This was my territory. I had earned my name on the glass doors through years of relentless work, outmaneuvering corporate tax evaders, and building an untouchable reputation. Julian and his family thought they could dictate the terms of my life. But as I stepped out of the elevator onto the polished marble floor of my office lobby, I felt my power return fully. I passed reception, giving a brief nod to my executive assistant, Marcus. I didn't bother explaining my oversized thrift store hoodie or my sudden reappearance. I walked straight into my corner office, closed the heavy oak door behind me, and sat down at my massive mahogany desk. I pulled up my secure terminal and inserted the encrypted flash drive I had taken from my townhouse. My first priority was securing my clients. If Julian managed to falsify a medical power of attorney, he could try to access my firm's master accounts. I initiated a full lockdown protocol on my professional credentials, transferring all active case files to an offline server and revoking every external access permission tied to my name. Then I opened a backdoor search through the corporate registry network. I needed to map every shell company connected to Kendrick's boutique law firm. Apex Holdings was only one thread, and I was about to unravel the entire sweater. I had been tracing a massive network of offshore bank transfers for 20 minutes when a sudden commotion erupted outside my office door. I stopped, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The heavy oak door muffled the sound, but I could hear Marcus's voice raised in frantic protest. A second later, the handle rattled violently. When it didn't open, someone started pounding on the solid wood. "Simone, open this door right now." It was Evelyn. Her voice was shrill, echoing loud enough to carry through the executive floor. I saved my progress, ejected the flash drive, and slid it into my pocket. I stood up, smoothed the front of my hoodie, and walked to the door. I unlocked the bolt and opened it. Evelyn and Chloe burst into my office like a localized hurricane. Marcus was right behind them, his face flushed with panic, holding a phone in his hand. "I'm so sorry, Simone," Marcus stammered. They refused to wait in reception. They just walked past security. "It's fine." Still, watching them perform. It was a masterclass in weaponized fragility from Chloe and aristocratic outrage from Evelyn. They were trying to provoke me into reacting. They wanted anger. They wanted volatility. They wanted me to look exactly like the unstable black woman narrative they were building. If I lost control, my partners would see liability. If I raised my voice, Evelyn would win. So I gave them nothing. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the intercom. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Please inform the partners that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law are currently experiencing a severe emotional crisis. I apologize for the disruption." Evelyn gasped. "How dare you?" she snapped. "You're the one stealing from my son." "If you have evidence of embezzlement," I replied evenly, "you should contact federal authorities immediately." I encourage it. In fact, I am fully prepared to open my books to the IRS today. I tilted my head slightly. "Are you and Kendrick prepared to do the same with Apex Holdings?" The color drained from Evelyn's face. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She looked at Chloe, panic cracking through her composure. Chloe's expression changed immediately. The performance was gone. "You can't just throw around baseless accusations," she said quickly, stepping back. "They're not baseless," I said softly. "But this is a private financial firm, not a country club for emotional outbursts. You have 10 seconds to leave my office before building security removes you." At that exact moment, the glass lobby doors opened and 3 security officers in dark uniforms marched down the corridor. Marcus pointed. The lead officer stepped inside. "Ma'am," he said, taking Evelyn by the arm, "you need to come with us." "Get your hands off me!" Evelyn screamed, swinging her designer handbag wildly. Her composure collapsed completely. She knocked a crystal paperweight off my desk. It shattered on the floor. "You know who I am," she shouted. "My son owns half this city." The officers didn't react. They restrained her efficiently and began escorting her out as she kicked and screamed. Chloe didn't wait. She turned and almost ran for the elevator, abandoning Evelyn instantly. I stood in silence as the shouting faded down the hallway. When the doors finally closed, the office went still. I turned to my colleagues in the corridor. "I'll be taking a brief leave to handle a hostile domestic situation," I said. "My files are secured. My clients are protected. Marcus has my emergency protocols. If anyone from my husband's family contacts this firm again, involve corporate counsel and file a restraining order immediately." My senior partner nodded slowly. "Crystal clear, Simone. Do what you need to do." I returned to my office, closed the door, and grabbed my bag. The war wasn't over, but I had just won the first public battle. I headed down the private executive stairwell. The reassurance that it was just standard protection. Now I read it like evidence. Page 42. Buried beneath dense legal language about property division was a clause that didn't belong. A medical incapacitation clause. Not standard. Not neutral. A trap. If either spouse was declared mentally or medically unfit by a single licensed physician, the other would immediately gain full, irrevocable power of attorney. No waiting period. No second opinion. No court oversight. If Julian's people had succeeded in dragging me to that private facility this morning, one hired doctor would have signed a single document. And with that signature, Julian would have gained complete control over every account, every asset, every piece of my life. He wouldn't have needed to kill me immediately. He would have owned me first. I closed the document. My jaw was clenched so tightly my teeth ached. Julian had built the perfect safety net. If he couldn't quietly poison me in a restaurant, he would erase me legally through the psychiatric system. But why the sudden urgency? Julian had spent a full year carefully preparing me, building the flawless illusion of a wealthy, successful power couple. Why accelerate the timeline so recklessly now, risking a messy, violent extraction at my townhouse? Murder and kidnapping were acts of desperation. I needed to know exactly what was driving that desperation. I opened a secure, encrypted portal directly connected to international corporate registry databases. It was time to find out who this family really was. I started with Apex Holdings LLC, the shell company that had swallowed my $50,000. I traced the routing numbers through Delaware's state registry, peeling back layers of corporate anonymity. Apex Holdings was a subsidiary of a group called Blue Capital. Blue Capital, in turn, was the primary asset manager for the family trust. I pulled the financial files for the trust and Kendrick's real estate development firm. Julian and Kendrick drove $100,000 cars. Evelyn lived in a sprawling estate in Buget and wore custom designer clothing to Sunday service. Chloe spent her weekends drinking mimosas at the most exclusive country clubs in the state. They projected the image of untouchable generational black wealth. But I ignored the public facade and looked at the raw numbers. And the data didn't lie. It hit me like a physical blow. They were broke. Not temporarily strained, catastrophically, irreversibly bankrupt. Page after page of red ink confirmed it. Kendrick's flagship real estate firm hadn't successfully completed a commercial development in 4 years. Every property they claimed to own was leveraged to its absolute limit. They had taken massive high-interest loans against existing assets just to sustain their lifestyle, and those loans were now in active default. Evelyn's estate was in pre-foreclosure. She was 3 months behind on her mortgage, and the bank was preparing to seize the property within 60 days. Chloe's country club memberships were suspended for non-payment. Kendrick was facing multiple civil lawsuits from unpaid contractors and investors demanding repayment. They weren't a dynasty. They were a Ponzi scheme. And the only reason it hadn't collapsed 3 years ago was a single injection of exactly $5 million in liquid cash. I cross-referenced the dates. The deposit into the family trust aligned perfectly with Maya's life insurance payout. Desperate, drowning frauds surviving only by draining the lives of the women Julian targeted. My $50,000 bridge loan wasn't for zoning paperwork. It was an emergency patch to stop Kendrick's creditors from filing criminal fraud charges this week. Julian had tried to kill me because Evelyn's house was about to be foreclosed. My death wasn't personal. It was accounting. A scheduled transaction to balance their books. I ejected the flash drive and shut down the terminal. The fear that had driven me since the restaurant was gone burned away into something cold and precise. They needed my money to survive, and they were running out of time. If I stayed hidden, they would either find me or force a judge to activate the power of attorney in my absence. I couldn't hide. I had to go back. Straight into the lion's den. I had to act like the terrified, broken wife Julian expected, and use his desperation against him until the entire rotten structure collapsed under its own weight. I left my office and called a taxi back to the townhouse. The ride gave me 20 minutes to bury the confident, ruthless version of myself and reconstruct the frightened woman Julian needed to see. By the time I arrived, I looked wrecked. Red-eyed. Exhausted. Small. Julian's car was already in the driveway. He was waiting. Inside, the house was silent. Chloe's broken cup had been cleaned up. No trace remained of the morning's violence. Julian sat on my velvet sofa, a glass of bourbon in hand, staring into the dead fireplace. He stood the moment I entered. Rigid posture. Tight jaw. Ready for control. Ready to escalate. I dropped my duffel bag loudly onto the floor and collapsed. I didn't hesitate. I broke. I fell to my knees and started crying loud, messy, uncontained. "I'm so sorry," I sobbed. "Julian, I'm so sorry. You were right. You were right about everything." He froze. The calculated anger in his face flickered. confusion, opportunity. I kept going. I don't know what's wrong with me, I choked out. The stress. I thought I was being followed. I thought you were going to hurt me. I think I'm losing my mind. I don't want to be sick, I whispered. Please don't let them take me away. His expression softened instantly. Ego recognized compliance. He set his drink down and knelt beside me, pulling me into his arms. I forced myself not to recoil. I've got you, he murmured. We're going to get you help. I nodded against his chest, pretending to dissolve into safety. I'll sign anything, I whispered. Anything you need. And just like that, I handed him the illusion of control. He believed it. An hour later, he went upstairs for a shower. The moment the water turned on, I moved. I grabbed my bag, extracted my encrypted drive, and headed upstairs. Julian never left his laptop exposed. It was locked in a leather briefcase in his private office. The lock was a 3-digit combination. He was too arrogant for randomness. I tried his birthday. Click. The case opened. I inserted my drive, forced a system boot bypass, and began a full sector-by-sector clone of his hard drive. The screen filled with a green progress bar. 10%. 40%. The bathroom door creaked. The shower shut off. 80%. I froze. Footsteps. 95%. Come on, I whispered. 100%. Complete. I yanked the drive, snapped the laptop shut, resealed the briefcase. Brick, columns, luxury cars, manicured hedges. But I knew better now. Foreclosure notices were already in motion. Unpaid vendors. Frozen credit. Impending collapse. Inside, they greeted me like royalty. Evelyn kissed the air beside my cheek. Chloe wore diamonds bought with Maya's death money. Kendrick bragged about imaginary deals I knew didn't exist. And I sat at the table, smiling faintly, listening, waiting. I kept the expression on my face soft and broken, even as I watched their carefully constructed world start to fracture in real time. The pen lay abandoned on the porcelain plate. The unsigned deed sat inside the manila folder like a dead weight. And for the first time all evening, no one was trying to speak over anyone else. Julian's hand had gone still on my back. Not comforting anymore, controlling, calculating. I could feel it. He was no longer playing husband. He was reassessing a threat. I kept my eyes lowered, my posture small, my breathing uneven, exactly what they expected from me. Inside, I was already counting steps. They had slipped. Just once. But it was enough. Because when Kendrick dropped his fork earlier, when Chloe froze mid-sip, when Evelyn's grip tightened on the tablecloth, that wasn't just shock. That was recognition. Not of guilt. Of exposure. I had said too much in the language they actually understood. Money. Structure. Debt. Collapse. And now they were doing what all failing systems do when pressure enters the chamber. They were trying to find the leak. Julian finally broke the silence, his voice carefully controlled. That's a very serious case you're describing. I let out a small, tired laugh, as if I hadn't just detonated their entire financial reality at the dinner table. It's what I do, I said lightly. It's just work. Nothing more. Evelyn's eyes stayed locked on me. Not blinking. Not reacting. Measuring. Chloe forced a brittle laugh. You're mixing work and paranoia again, Simone, she said, but her voice had lost its edge. That IRS story sounds like stress talking. I tilted my head slightly as if considering it. Maybe, I said gently. Or maybe it's just what happens when you spend too long looking at other people's books. That landed. I saw Kendrick shift in his chair. Just a fraction. But enough. Julian leaned down slightly, his lips near my ear again, but this time there was no warmth in it. Only pressure. You're exhausted, he murmured. We should go home after this. I nodded faintly. Yes, I whispered. Home sounds good. But I was already thinking about something else. Not home. Exit routes. Because now they knew. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to be afraid. And afraid people don't behave predictably. They escalate. The dinner continued after that, but it wasn't a dinner anymore. It was a surveillance exercise disguised as family ritual. Every laugh was delayed. Every bite was measured. Every glance lingered half a second too long. And I stayed exactly what they needed me to be. Fragile. Distracted. Recovering. By the time dessert was served, I had already stopped eating entirely. My role for the night was complete. I had bought time. I had planted uncertainty. And most importantly, I had made them doubt which version of me was real. When Julian finally stood and offered his hand, I took it without hesitation. Soft. Compliant. Perfect. But as I rose from that table, I understood something clearly. They were no longer trying to control my money. They were trying to understand me. And once predators start studying the prey instead of hunting it directly, they stop noticing how close the net is getting. The second document appeared instantly on the towering screens. A full corporate audit breakdown, layered beneath it. No one breathed the same way anymore. Kendrick took one step backward, then another. Like distance could erase evidence. Evelyn's hand tightened around the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went gray. Julian stood frozen on the stage behind me. I didn't look at him yet. I let the room see it first. Let it settle. Let it become real. Only then did I turn slightly, just enough for him to hear me without the microphone. You built your entire empire on one assumption, I said quietly. That I would never read the fine print. A flicker moved across his face. Not anger. Recognition. Fear, finally uncontained. I turned back to the audience. My voice stayed steady. Controlled. For months, I was told I was unstable, I said. That I was paranoid. That I was breaking down under pressure. I let the words hang. Then I pressed the button again. Another screen. Life insurance policy. Maya's name. Julian's signature. Then another. A second policy. My name. Same structure. Same beneficiary. Same pattern. A ripple went through the room. Someone stood up in the back. Then another. Phones were no longer discreet. They were recording openly now. The narrative had changed hands. I finally looked at Julian. He was no longer performing. No charm. No composure. No mask. Just calculation collapsing into panic. He stepped forward. Simone, he said low, dangerous now. Stop this. I tilted my head slightly. You always liked that I was good with numbers, I replied. A pause. I just decided to show the full picture. Chloe moved first. Not toward me. Away. Quickly. She understood what was happening faster than anyone else in the room. Kendrick followed a beat later. Evelyn stayed seated, but only because she couldn't process standing up without confirming it was real. Julian reached for the microphone again. I didn't stop him. I didn't need to. He grabbed it. But the system was already overridden. His voice didn't matter anymore. Because the screens behind us continued without him. Bank transfers. Email chains. Recorded calls. Names. Dates. Numbers. Patterns no one could unsee. A security guard moved toward the stage. Not for me. For him. That was the moment it shifted fully. Julian realized it too. He looked at me one last time. Not like a husband. Not like a partner. Like someone recalculating an exit that no longer existed. I stepped back from the podium. Calm. Finished. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was surviving him. I felt like I was done responding to him at all. The ballroom erupted not in chaos, but in controlled collapse. Whispers became calls. Calls became instructions. Instructions became consequences. And as security moved in, I walked off the stage without looking back. Not because I was afraid of what came next, but because there was nothing left to perform. The chaos didn't stay contained for even a second. Security rushed the stage first, two men in black suits moving through the shocked crowd while a third tried to cut the audio feed, but it was already too late. The recording had done its job. Julian's voice, calm and methodical while describing a tragic attack and a transfer of power, was now echoing through every corner of the ballroom like a verdict. Phones were up everywhere. Not discreetly anymore, openly, aggressively, live streaming. Julian stood frozen for half a beat longer, still facing me as if he could will reality to rewind itself. Then something in him snapped into motion. He lunged again, not at me this time, but toward the control panel at the edge of the stage, as if shutting it down could undo what hundreds of people had already heard. He tried to speak, tried to pivot, to perform, to slip back into the version of himself that always sounded reasonable in a room full of powerful people. But nobody was listening anymore. Behind him, Chloe was shouting now too, trying to deny, trying to explain, trying to reinsert control into something that had already been documented, recorded, broadcast. Kendrick stepped forward like he might intervene, but stopped when he saw the phones. Hundreds of them. Every angle covered. The room wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to the evidence. As Julian was escorted away from the stage, his eyes stayed locked on mine one last time. The composure he had worn so perfectly for so long was gone, stripped down to something raw and unfamiliar. Not regret. Not remorse. Panic at losing control of the outcome. I didn't follow him with my eyes. I turned instead toward the audience. Cameras were still rolling. People were still whispering, still processing what they had just heard. I lifted the microphone again, not because I needed to speak louder than them, but because I didn't want anything lost in the noise. "My name is Simone," I said clearly. "And everything you just heard is backed by financial records, encrypted communications, and forensic audits already in the hands of federal investigators." A pause. Not for drama. For certainty. This is not a misunderstanding. It is not a personal dispute. It is an organized financial and criminal scheme involving fraud, coercion, and attempted murder. The word murder finally made the room break in a different way. Not chaos now. Focus. Phones tilted upward. Security stopped hesitating. The exits were being managed more tightly. And for the first time since I had walked into their world, the story was no longer something they could rewrite. It was already out of their control. The room didn't react immediately to that name. Not because they hadn't heard it, but because they needed a second to understand what had just changed. Maya. It was no longer an indirect reference buried in a leaked recording. It was being named live under white lights, in front of witnesses, investors, and cameras. Julian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time since you met him, he had no prepared answer. Around him, the chaos in the ballroom began to reorganize into something colder, focused attention. People stopped shouting and started listening. Phones that had been recording the scandal now locked onto him. And then you spoke again. "I found Maya's file," you said, steady and controlled, "and I found exactly how her death was covered up." A low murmur spread through the room, heavier this time. Not curiosity anymore. Understanding. Julian stepped back again, but this time there was no stage left to shield him, no speech left to rebuild him.